My name is Brother Militant Vex Cadrian, and I was there when reality broke open above Titan. I need you to understand something before I tell you what I witnessed in the warp storms that followed. When the Supreme Grand Master of the Grey Knights vanishes into the Imperium, he does not simply disappear. He becomes something else entirely, something that exists between the spaces where sanity ends and nightmare begins. The fortress monastery of Titan hung in the void like a blade of sanctified steel, its ancient halls echoing with the prayers of 1,000 Grey Knights. For 700 years, the chapter had stood as humanity's shield against the horrors that dwelt beyond the veil of reality. We were the Emperor's secret, his chosen warriors trained to face demons and madness with bolter and blade. But on that day, as the warp storms gathered around Mortarian's plague fleet, we would learn that even the most sacred of warriors could be lost to forces beyond comprehension. I was serving as aide to Supreme Grand Master Kaldor Draigo when the astropathic choir began screaming. Not the usual strain of receiving distant messages, but genuine terror that echoed through the fortress like a physical thing. The Vox channels filled with reports of warp anomalies throughout the system, reality tears that spat forth horrors from the realm of chaos. But these were not random incursions. They were coordinated, purposeful, part of some vast pattern that stretched across multiple sectors. Draigo stood before the great viewing port of his chambers, his Terminator armor gleaming in the cold light of distant stars. He was a giant among giants, even by Astartes standards, his presence filling the room with an authority that transcended mere rank. His Stormbolter hung at his side, blessed by the chapter's tech marines and inscribed with wards that hurt to look at directly. But it was his Force sword that drew the eye, the Titan's Horde, a blade forged from metal that had never known the touch of chaos, its edge sharp enough to cut through the fabric of reality itself. "My lord," I began, but he raised a gauntleted hand for silence. His enhanced hearing had already detected what my own augmented senses were only beginning to register: the sound of something vast moving through the void, displacement that spoke of ships larger than battle barges, creatures that existed partially outside normal space. "Mortarian comes," Draigo said, his voice carrying the weight of certainty that only the most experienced warriors possess. "The demon Primarch seeks to corrupt this system, to turn our fortress into another of his plague gardens. But he brings with him something else, something that has been hunting me across the decades since our last encounter." The tactical displays around us began updating with new contact signatures, massive bioships that registered on our sensors as partially corporeal, their forms shifting between matter and pure warp energy. The Death Guard fleet that accompanied them was impressive enough. Dozens of plague ships whose very presence contaminated local space with psychic miasma. But the real threat came from the things that traveled alongside them, entities that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, their attention focused not on Titan itself, but on its Supreme Grand Master. I had served under Draigo for 15 years, had witnessed his battles against demon princes and chaos sorcerers, had seen him banish entities whose names could not be spoken without inviting madness. But I had never seen him display the kind of grim satisfaction that crossed his features as he watched the approaching fleet. It was the expression of a man who had been waiting for this moment, who had prepared for it with the patience of someone who understood that some conflicts transcend individual battles. "Inform Brother Captain Stern that he has command of the fortress defenses," Draigo ordered, his attention still focused on the tactical displays. "Have the Third Brotherhood deploy to secondary positions and ensure that the warding systems are at maximum strength. What comes next will test every protection we have built around this sacred place." The orders were transmitted with practiced efficiency, but even as our forces moved to defensive positions, I could sense that something fundamental was different about this engagement. The usual patterns of void warfare, the careful positioning of ships and calculation of firing solutions seemed almost irrelevant in the face of what was approaching. This was not a battle that would be decided by superior firepower or tactical advantage. This was something older, more primal, a conflict that had its roots in the deepest mysteries of the warp itself. Mortarian's flagship emerged from the leading edge of the Plague Fleet like a mountain of corrupted metal and diseased flesh. The Endurance had been transformed since its fall to chaos. Its original structure warped into something that violated basic principles of physics and engineering. Organic growths covered its hull like cancerous tumors, and the space around it rippled with psychic distortions that made it painful to observe directly. But even this monument to corruption paled beside the presence that accompanied it. The entity that manifested alongside Mortarian's ship defied easy description. It existed partially in real space and partially in the warp, its form shifting constantly between different configurations of matter and energy. Sometimes it appeared as a vast mechanical construct, its surfaces covered with symbols that hurt the mind to perceive. Other times it took on organic characteristics, a living thing of impossible size whose biology followed no earthly pattern. But always, at its core, there burned an intelligence so ancient and malevolent that proximity to it induced religious terror in even the most hardened warriors. Etaos Raukeres, Draigo spoke the name with careful precision, each syllable weighted with power and danger. The slaughterer of souls, bringer of despair, the entity that has stalked me through a dozen campaigns. It comes at last to claim what it believes is owed. The name meant nothing to me then, though I would learn its significance in the hours that followed. Etaos Raukeres was one of the greater demons of chaos undivided, an entity so powerful that its true name was forbidden knowledge among even the Grey Knights. It had been bound by ancient pacts and imperial sorcery for millennia, but those bindings had been weakening, and now it sought to break free entirely by claiming the soul of humanity's greatest demon hunter. The battle began with the traditional exchange of lance fire and torpedo spreads, Titan's defensive platforms engaging the Plague Fleet at maximum range. But even as our weapons found their marks, scoring hits against corrupted hulls and burning away diseased armor plating, it became clear that the physical confrontation was merely a distraction. The real war was being fought on levels that conventional sensors could not detect, in the spaces between dimensions where thought and reality intersected. Draigo's quarters filled with the sound of alarms as the fortress monastery's psychic defenses came under assault. The Grey Knights maintained some of the most sophisticated anti-demon wards in the Imperium, barriers of faith and sanctified technology that had been refined over centuries of conflict with the forces of chaos. But what struck against them now was not the crude battering of lesser demons or the subtle corruption of chaos sorcerers. This was something that understood the fundamental architecture of imperial defenses, that had studied them for millennia, and developed countermeasures that exploited weaknesses no human mind had ever conceived. The first breach occurred in the lower levels of the fortress, where the ancient foundations met the bedrock of Titan itself. Reality simply tore open like fabric under stress, creating a wound in space through which things that should not exist began to pour. The Grey Knights stationed in those areas responded with practiced efficiency, their storm bolters spitting blessed ammunition while their force weapons carved through demonic flesh. But for every entity they banished, two more emerged from the growing rift, and the corruption began to spread upward through the fortress levels. "It seeks to draw me out," Draigo observed, watching the tactical displays as breach after breach appeared throughout the monastery. "Etaos Araukeres knows that I cannot allow the fortress to fall, that I will be forced to engage it directly rather than risk the corruption of this sacred place." I found myself caught between admiration for his tactical assessment and horror at its implications. The entity was using the entire Grey Knights chapter as bait, threatening thousands of the Emperor's finest warriors to force a single confrontation. The casual scale of its planning, the willingness to sacrifice countless demons and corrupted mortals for one specific objective, spoke to an intelligence that operated according to timescales and priorities completely alien to human understanding. the Supreme Grand Master began the ritual preparations that would allow him to face such an entity. His Terminator armor was already blessed with the most powerful wards the chapter could provide, but facing a greater demon required additional protections. He spoke the litanies of banishment, words of power that had been developed over 10,000 years of conflict with chaos. Each syllable was pronounced with perfect precision, the sounds themselves carrying force that resonated through both real space and the warp. The Titan's Ward began to glow with cold fire as Draigo drew it from its sheath, the blade responding to the psychic energies he channeled through its consecrated metal. The weapon had been forged from materials that existed in a state of absolute purity, metal that had never been touched by chaos corruption, and never would be. Its edge could cut through demonic flesh as easily as it parted steel, and its mere presence was anathema to the creatures of the warp. As the preparations continued, I became aware of something that filled me with a dread deeper than any physical threat. The breaches throughout the fortress were not random, but were forming a pattern, a geometric configuration that served some purpose beyond simple invasion. The demons pouring through each rift moved with coordination that suggested unified command. But more than that, their positions were creating nodes of corruption that began to resonate with each other. "A summoning circle," Draigo said, confirming my fears. Etaos Araucares uses the entire fortress as a ritual space, each breach a point of power in a configuration designed to anchor it fully in real space. When the pattern is complete, it will no longer need to divide its attention between dimensions. It will be able to bring its full power to bear without the limitations that normally constrain demon manifestation. The implications were staggering. If the entity succeeded in its summoning, Titan would become a demon world, its reality permanently altered to accommodate the presence of chaos. Every Grey Knight in the fortress would face corruption or death, and the knowledge contained in our archives would fall into the hands of the enemy. Worse still, the loss of the chapter would remove one of the Imperium's most effective weapons against demonic incursion, leaving countless worlds vulnerable to the predations of chaos. But there was another possibility, one that Draigo had been considering since the first reports of warp storms reached us. If he could reach the center of the summoning pattern before it was completed, if he could engage Etaos Araucares directly while it was still partially bound between dimensions, he might be able to disrupt the ritual entirely. The cost would be enormous, requiring him to enter the warp itself and fight the demon on its home ground. But it was the only chance to save both the fortress and the chapter. "My lord," I began, understanding finally what he intended. "You cannot mean to—" "I must," he interrupted, his voice carrying the finality of an order that would not be questioned. "This entity has hunted me for decades, following my campaigns across the galaxy, waiting for the moment when circumstances would allow it to strike at maximum advantage. It has chosen this ground, this moment, because it believes the cost of failure will force me to accept whatever risks are necessary to prevent the fall of Titan." He was correct, of course. The entity's strategy was perfectly calculated to exploit the one weakness that all Grey Knights shared: their absolute dedication to protecting humanity from the horrors of chaos. Draigo could not allow the fortress to become a demon world, could not permit the knowledge and expertise of the chapter to be corrupted, regardless of the personal cost. The preparation ritual that followed was unlike anything I had witnessed in my years of service. Draigo began by inscribing protective wards directly onto his Terminator armor, using consecrated silver blessed by the chapter's chaplains. Each symbol was drawn with precise care, their geometric patterns designed to channel and focus psychic energy while providing protection against the corrupting influence of the warp. The process took hours, but time was a luxury they did not possess. Even as he worked, reports continued to arrive of new breaches opening throughout the fortress, each one bringing Etaos Araucares closer to completing its summoning circle. Brother Captain Stern arrived as the preparations neared completion, his own Terminator armor scarred by recent combat with the demonic incursions. His face was grim as he surveyed the ritual materials spread across Draigo's chambers, understanding immediately what they portended. "My lord," Stern said, his voice carefully controlled. "The Third Brotherhood stands ready for whatever orders you may give. The fortress defenses are holding, but the enemy's strategy is becoming clear. They are not seeking to overrun our positions, but to maintain them long enough for their ritual to reach completion." Draigo nodded without looking up from his work. "How long do we have?" "Our analysts estimate perhaps 6 hours before the summoning circle reaches critical resonance. After that, we will be facing something far beyond our ability to contain." The timeline was brutal, but not unexpected. Draigo had been calculating the same variables, weighing the risks of premature action against the certainty of catastrophic failure if he waited too long. The entity's strategy was perfect in its simplicity. Create a situation where the defender was forced to act before preparation was complete, ensuring that any response would be desperate and likely doomed to failure. "Brother Stern," Draigo said, finally looking up from his inscriptions, "you will assume command of the chapter in my absence. The Codex Astartes provides clear guidelines for succession, but the circumstances we face require decisions that transcend standard doctrine. Use your judgment, trust in the Emperor's guidance, and remember that our duty extends beyond the preservation of our own lives." The formal transfer of authority was conducted with ceremonial precision, despite the chaos erupting throughout the fortress. Stern knelt before his Supreme Grand Master, accepting the burden of command with the same stoic determination that had marked his entire career. But I could see the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a physical thing, the understanding that he might soon be leading the Grey Knights through their darkest hour. As the ritual preparations entered their final phase, I found myself thinking about the nature of sacrifice and duty. The Grey Knights were trained from their earliest recruitment to accept death in service to the Emperor, to face any horror rather than allow the corruption of chaos to spread unchecked. But what Draigo was contemplating went beyond simple martyrdom. He was choosing to enter a realm where death might be preferable to survival, where the very concepts of self and identity could be stripped away without warning. The final breach opened in the chamber where we stood, reality tearing apart with a sound like breaking glass mixed with screaming voices. The rift expanded rapidly, its edges flickering with colors that had no names in human language, until it filled the entire wall of Draigo's quarters. Through the gap, I could see the realm of chaos in all its terrible glory, a landscape of impossible geometry where thought and emotion took physical form, where the laws of physics were suggestions rather than absolute rules. Itao Soraukeres emerged from the rift like a tide of living darkness, its form shifting and changing as it adapted to the constraints of real space. In one moment it appeared as a massive mechanical construct, its surfaces covered with gears and pistons that moved according to no earthly purpose. In the next, it took on organic characteristics, becoming a thing of teeth and claws and burning eyes that defied anatomical logic. But always, at its core, there remained an intelligence so vast and malevolent that contact with it induced madness in unprepared minds. The entity spoke, its voice a harmony of sounds that seemed to come from multiple sources simultaneously. Some emanated from its physical form, while others emerged directly from the air around us, bypassing the normal mechanics of sound production entirely. The words it used were High Gothic, but pronounced with inflections that suggested meanings far removed from human understanding. Kaldor Draigo, it said, and my enhanced nervous system registered the psychic weight carried by each syllable. Champion of the false emperor, slayer of the innocent, you have evaded my attention for too long. The debt between us remains unpaid, the bargain unfulfilled. You will accompany me now to the realm where such matters are properly resolved." Draigo stepped forward, the Titan's sword blazing with cold fire as he raised it to guard position. His Terminator armor hummed with power as its systems responded to the presence of a greater demon, energy fields and protective wards activating automatically. But even with all these protections, I could see the strain that proximity to the entity placed upon him. Sweat beaded on his forehead, despite the armor's climate control, and his breathing had become labored as his body fought against the psychic pressure. "I owe you nothing, creature," Draigo replied, his voice steady, despite the obvious effort required to speak in the entity's presence. "The deaths you reference were necessary to prevent far greater suffering. I will not be held accountable for choosing the lesser evil when no other options remained." The conversation that followed was unlike anything in my experience of warfare. These were not the crude threats and boasts that typically preceded combat, but a philosophical debate conducted at the highest levels of intellectual complexity. Etaos Rauqueres spoke of cosmic justice and universal balance, arguing that Draigo's actions in previous campaigns had disrupted natural orders that transcended human understanding. The Supreme Grand Master countered with arguments about duty and necessity, the obligation to protect humanity regardless of the larger consequences. But beneath the intellectual discourse, I could sense the real nature of their conflict. This was not about philosophy or morality, but about power and control. The entity sought to claim Draigo not because of any debt or injustice, but because his soul represented a prize beyond calculation. A grey knight of his stature, corrupted and turned to chaos, would be worth entire armies of lesser champions. The knowledge he possessed, the techniques he had mastered, the connections he maintained within the Imperium's secret hierarchies, all of this would become weapons in the hands of chaos if Etaos Rauqueres succeeded in its goal. The entity's form began to solidify as more of its essence poured through the rift, taking on characteristics that seemed designed specifically to unnerve its opponent. It adopted features that resembled fallen Grey Knights, warriors who had died under Draigo's command in previous campaigns. Their faces stared out from its shifting surface, their expressions twisted into accusations of betrayal and abandonment. It was psychological warfare of the most sophisticated kind, using Draigo's own memories and guilt as weapons against him. But the Supreme Grand Master had faced such tactics before, and his response was immediate and decisive. He began reciting the canticles of purification, prayers that had been specifically developed to counter demonic influence on human psychology. Each word was a weapon against the entity's attempts at mental manipulation, cutting through its illusions to strike at the core of its being. The Titan's sword flared brighter as the canticles continued, its blessed metal resonating with the sacred words. Etaos Rauqueres recoiled as if struck by a physical blow, its form wavering as the prayers disrupted its psychic attacks. But the entity was far too powerful to be defeated by words alone, and its response was swift and terrible. The chamber around us began to change, its walls flowing like liquid as the daemon's presence warped local reality. The floor beneath our feet became uncertain, sometimes solid stone, other times empty air that forced us to rely on faith alone to prevent falling into infinite void. The battle that erupted was unlike anything I had witnessed in my years of service. This was not combat in any conventional sense, but a clash between competing realities, each participant trying to impose their version of physics and causality on the space around them. Draigo's force sword cut through demonic flesh that reformed almost instantly, while the entity's attacks came in forms that defied description. Blades of crystallized hatred, waves of psychic energy that targeted the soul rather than the body, tendrils of pure entropy that aged whatever they touched by centuries in seconds. The rift behind Etaos Rauqueres continued to expand, pouring more daemons into the chamber with each passing moment. Lesser entities, spawn of chaos that existed only to serve their greater master, but dangerous enough to overwhelm even a Grey Knight if they attacked in sufficient numbers. I found myself pressed into combat, my Stormbolter spitting blessed ammunition while my force weapon carved through demonic forms. But I was aware throughout the engagement that my role in this conflict was essentially irrelevant. The real battle was between Draigo and the entity, a contest of wills that would determine not just our immediate fate, but the future of the entire chapter. As the combat continued, I began to understand the true scope of what was happening. The summoning circle that Etaos Araucares had created throughout the fortress was not just designed to anchor it in real space, but to open a permanent gateway between dimensions. If the ritual succeeded, the boundary between the warp and reality would be dissolved in this location, creating a wound in space that could never be healed. Diamonds would pour through in endless streams, and the corruption would spread throughout the system like a disease. Draigo understood this as well, and his tactics began to change accordingly. Instead of trying to destroy the entity outright, he focused his attacks on the ritual components, using the Titan's Ward to sever the psychic connections that linked the various breach points throughout the fortress. Each successful strike weakened the summoning circle, but also forced him to divide his attention between offense and defense, leaving him vulnerable to the entity's counterattacks. The price of this strategy became apparent when one of Etaos Araucares' attacks found its mark. A tendril of pure corruption struck Draigo's left shoulder, passing through his Terminator armor as if it were paper. The Supreme Grand Master stumbled but did not fall, though I could see that the wound was unlike any physical injury. The corruption was spreading through his system, fighting against the genetic modifications and psychic conditioning that protected all Grey Knights from chaos influence. But instead of weakening him, the injury seemed to galvanize Draigo's resolve. He began reciting the exorcisms of absolute banishment, the most powerful prayers in the Grey Knight's arsenal, words that were said to have been spoken by the Emperor himself during the First War against Chaos. The chamber filled with golden light as the sacred words took effect, and for a moment, the entity's form became translucent, as if it were being pulled back toward the warp. That was when everything changed. The rift behind Etaos Araucares suddenly expanded beyond all previous limits, becoming not just a gateway, but a vortex that began drawing everything in the chamber toward it. The entity's form began to break apart, not from Draigo's banishment, but from the tremendous forces being generated by its own summoning ritual. The summoning circle had become unstable, its energies feeding back on themselves in a cascade reaction that threatened to tear open reality itself. Draigo realized immediately what was happening. The entity had miscalculated, allowing its desire for revenge to override the careful planning that should have governed such a massive ritual. The summoning was collapsing, but instead of simply failing, it was becoming something far more dangerous. A permanent tear in the fabric of space-time, a wound that would never heal and would continue to grow until it consumed first Titan, then the entire solar system. The Supreme Grand Master had perhaps seconds to make a decision that would affect billions of lives. He could allow the ritual to collapse completely, which would destroy the entity, but also create a warp storm of unprecedented magnitude. Or he could enter the rift himself, using his presence to stabilize the collapsing energies long enough to guide them toward a controlled dissipation. The first option would save the immediate area, but doom countless other worlds to the chaos that would follow. The second would preserve the galaxy, but cost him everything. There was never really any choice. "Brother Kadrian," Draigo called out over the howling winds generated by the collapsing rift. "Remember what you have witnessed here. Record everything. Ensure that the chapter understands what transpired and why. Tell them that Kaldor Draigo went willingly into the warp, not as a victim of chaos corruption, but as the Emperor's instrument of justice. He raised the Titan's sword high above his head, its blade now blazing with such intensity that looking at it directly was painful. The weapon's power reached its absolute peak as Draigo channeled not just his own psychic energy through it, but drew upon the spiritual strength of every Grey Knight who had ever wielded it. The sword became a conduit for the accumulated faith and determination of the entire chapter, a focus for power that transcended individual capability. With a final prayer to the Emperor, Draigo leapt into the rift. What happened next defies easy description, as it occurred in spaces where the normal laws of physics hold no sway. Through the collapsing gateway, I witnessed the Supreme Grand Master's entry into the realm of chaos itself, his Terminator armor blazing with golden fire as he struck out at entities that existed in dimensions my mind could not properly process. Etaos Raukeres was there, its form even more vast and terrible in its native environment, but now it was forced to fight on multiple fronts, as other powers of the warp sought to claim the prize it had brought within their reach. The battle that followed transcended anything that could be called combat in conventional terms. Draigo moved through landscapes of living emotion and crystallized thought, fighting enemies that changed form with each heartbeat, using weapons that existed only as long as he maintained absolute faith in their reality. The Titan's sword cut through barriers of impossibility, carving paths through territories where hope itself had been outlawed, where the very concept of resistance had been forgotten. But even as I watched, I could see that he was changing. The warp was not a place where human beings could exist unchanged, even those as pure and dedicated as the Grey Knights. The constant exposure to raw chaos was leaving its mark, not as corruption in the traditional sense, but as a fundamental alteration of his essential nature. He was becoming something new, something that existed partially in both realms, a being capable of operating in the warp without losing his humanity entirely. The rift began to stabilize as Draigo's presence provided an anchor point around which the chaotic energies could organize themselves. But the price of this stabilization was his permanent separation from real space. He had become the keystone that held the gateway closed, a living seal that prevented the warp from spilling into reality. As long as he maintained his position, as long as his will remained unbroken, the barrier between dimensions would hold. The last image I had of the Supreme Grand Master was of him standing alone in a realm of infinite darkness, surrounded by enemies that sought to corrupt or destroy him, his sword raised in eternal defiance against the forces of chaos. He had become something unprecedented in Imperial history, a living saint who existed in the heart of enemy territory, a beacon of the Emperor's light shining in the deepest darkness of the warp. The rift collapsed with a sound like reality, sighing in relief. The chamber returned to normal dimensions, though the walls remained scarred by the cosmic forces that had been unleashed within them. Etaos Raukeres was gone, banished back to whatever depths it had emerged from, its grand design thwarted by the sacrifice of a single man. The summoning circles throughout the fortress faded as their focal point disappeared, and the demon incursions that had threatened to overrun our defenses simply winked out of existence. But the victory felt hollow, purchased at a price that seemed too high to bear. The Grey Knights had lost their Supreme Grand Master, their greatest warrior, the man who had led them through countless campaigns against the forces of chaos. The chapter would continue, of course. There were other leaders, other heroes who could take up the burden of command, but none would be Kaldor Draigo, and none would carry the particular combination of skill, knowledge, and absolute dedication that had made him irreplaceable. In the days that followed, as we worked to repair the damage to the fortress and count our losses, reports began to come in from across the galaxy that suggested Draigo's sacrifice had had effects far beyond what we had initially understood. Warp storms that had been building for months suddenly dissipated. Demon incursions that should have succeeded instead failed catastrophically. Chaos cults that had been on the verge of achieving their dark objectives found their rituals disrupted by invisible forces. The first confirmed sighting came from the Cadian system, where a chaos incursion had been building for weeks. Planetary defense forces reported that their positions were being overrun by demon engines when suddenly the enemy forces began to falter. Witnesses described a figure in Terminator armor appearing among the chaos ranks, wielding a blazing sword that cut through demonic flesh like paper. The figure was there for perhaps minutes before disappearing, but the effect was decisive. The entire incursion collapsed, its leaders banished, and its lesser demons scattered to the warp. Similar reports began arriving from across the Segmentum Solar. A chaos sorcerer on Hydra Minoris found his grand summoning disrupted by an unknown force that spoke prayers in High Gothic. A demon prince attempting to manifest on Armageddon was beaten back by what survivors described as a warrior who fought with techniques unknown to any Imperial force. In each case, the intervention was brief but decisive, turning the tide at moments when conventional forces faced certain defeat. The pattern became impossible to ignore. Something was operating in the warp itself, striking at chaos forces with intimate knowledge of their weaknesses and capabilities. The interventions followed no predictable schedule, appeared to respond to no earthly command structure, but they consistently favored Imperial forces and civilian populations threatened by demonic incursion. Brother Captain Stern, now serving as acting Supreme Grand Master, established a special division within the chapter archives to collect and analyze these reports. The data they gathered painted a picture of unprecedented scope and effectiveness. In the 6 months following Draigo's disappearance, successful daemon incursions in the Sol system decreased by nearly 80%. Chaos cult activities that had been increasing for decades suddenly began to decline as their rituals failed with increasing frequency. The implications were staggering. Somehow, Draigo's presence in the warp was having effects that rippled across the galaxy. He had become a force of nature operating in the realm of chaos itself, striking at the fundamental sources of corruption and preventing incursions before they could fully manifest in real space. His effectiveness had been multiplied beyond all previous limits, even as the personal cost had grown beyond mortal comprehension. The Ordo Malleus classified the entire incident at the highest levels of secrecy, ensuring that knowledge of Draigo's fate would be restricted to only the most senior members of the Inquisition and the Grey Knights themselves. Officially, the Supreme Grand Master was listed as missing in action, presumed dead while investigating warp anomalies in a classified location. The truth was considered too dangerous to record in any permanent form, lest it be discovered by enemies who might find ways to exploit or corrupt it. But we who witnessed his sacrifice knew better. Kaldor Draigo had not died in the conventional sense, but had transcended the normal limitations of human existence to become something unprecedented. He was the Emperor's champion in the warp itself, a warrior who fought endless battles against the fundamental forces of chaos, preventing corruptions and incursions that would otherwise have consumed entire sectors. The reports continued to accumulate as months became years. Each intervention was documented, analyzed, and added to the growing body of evidence that the Supreme Grand Master's influence persisted beyond his physical presence in real space. The interventions showed a pattern of escalating sophistication, as if Draigo was learning to operate more effectively in his transformed state, developing new techniques for combating entities that existed outside normal space and time. On Scarus Prime, a chaos cult that had been planning a massive summoning ritual for months found their ceremony disrupted by what witnesses described as a figure who materialized in the center of their summoning circle. The intruder spoke a single word in a language that none of the cultists recognized, and the demon they had been attempting to summon simply ceased, not banished or destroyed, but erased from existence as if it had never been. The cultists themselves were found days later, completely insane but otherwise unharmed, babbling about a knight of light who had shown them the true emptiness of their beliefs. The sophistication of this intervention was unlike anything in previous reports. Rather than simply disrupting the ritual or banishing the demon, the unknown force had somehow prevented the entity from existing in the first place, retroactively unmaking the summoning in a way that suggested complete mastery of warp mechanics. It was a technique that no Imperial force possessed, a capability that seemed to transcend the normal limitations of psychic warfare. Similar escalations appeared in other reports. Demon princes found themselves confronting an opponent who seemed to know their every weakness, who could predict their attacks before they were conceived, who fought with a combination of martial skill and psychic power that no single being should have been able to achieve. The descriptions were consistent across multiple sources. A warrior in Terminator armor, whose presence radiated authority and absolute conviction, whose very existence seemed to cause pain to creatures of chaos. The implications extended beyond mere tactical advantage. These interventions suggested that Draigo had achieved something unprecedented in Imperial history: the ability to operate in the warp as a free agent, unbound by the normal constraints that limited human activity in that realm. He had become something that existed in both dimensions simultaneously, drawing power from the Emperor's light while moving freely through the domain of chaos. The theoretical framework for understanding his transformation came from the most ancient texts in the Grey Knight's archives, documents that dated back to the founding of the chapter and the earliest battles against chaos. These texts spoke of rare individuals who could transcend the normal boundaries between real space and the warp, becoming living bridges between dimensions. Such beings were said to possess capabilities that exceeded those of both humans and demons, operating according to principles that neither side fully understood. But the texts also warned of the prices such transformation demanded. To exist in the warp without corruption required absolute purity of purpose, unwavering faith in principles that could not be compromised under any circumstances. The slightest doubt, the smallest moral flexibility, would invite immediate corruption and transformation into something far worse than any demon. The individual would need to maintain perfect spiritual discipline while fighting enemies that could attack not just the body, but the very concepts of self and identity. The report suggested that Draigo had somehow achieved this impossible balance, maintaining his essential humanity while gaining the ability to operate effectively in the realm of chaos. But they also hinted at the ongoing cost of his existence. The interventions were becoming more frequent but also more brief, as if the effort required to manifest in real space was increasing over time. The descriptions of his appearance showed subtle changes, a gradual alteration that suggested adaptation to his hostile environment. On Medusa Fiv, planetary defense forces reported an intervention that lasted nearly an hour, during which the unknown warrior had systematically dismantled a chaos cult's operations across an entire city. But witnesses noted that his armor seemed to flicker occasionally, becoming translucent as if he existed only partially in real space. His voice, when he spoke, carried harmonics that suggested multiple speakers, as if he had begun to absorb or channel other presences from the warp. These changes were troubling, but not unexpected. The warp was not a place where human consciousness could exist unchanged indefinitely. Even the most disciplined and pure individuals would eventually be affected by prolonged exposure to raw chaos. The question was not whether Draigo would change, but whether those changes would compromise his essential mission or transform him into something that no longer served humanity's interests. The answer came during the Sabbath Worlds campaign, when Imperial forces faced their largest demon incursion in centuries. Chaos forces had established multiple beachheads across a dozen worlds, their combined activities threatening to tear open a permanent warp rift that would devastate the entire subsector. Conventional Imperial responses had proven inadequate, and the situation was deteriorating rapidly when reports began coming in of massive Daemon casualties with no corresponding Imperial victories. The intervention was unprecedented in its scope and duration. For 3 standard days, Chaos forces across the Sabbat worlds found themselves under attack by an enemy they could not identify or locate. Demon princes were banished faster than they could manifest. Chaos sorcerers found their rituals disrupted by forces that seemed to anticipate their every move. Entire legions of lesser demons simply vanished, leaving no trace of their existence. Imperial commanders initially assumed they were witnessing some form of factional warfare within the Chaos forces, but the pattern of destruction was too systematic, too purposeful. The unknown force was methodically dismantling the Chaos presence with surgical precision, targeting leadership elements and critical infrastructure while leaving civilian populations unharmed. It was the work of someone who understood both Imperial military doctrine and the fundamental weaknesses of Chaos organization. The climax came on Hagia, where the largest Chaos force had established its primary summoning site. Imperial reconnaissance reported that the ritual was nearing completion when a single figure materialized in the center of the enemy position. What followed was described by survivors as less a battle than an execution, with the unknown warrior moving through Chaos ranks with devastating efficiency. But the most remarkable aspect was not the tactical effectiveness, but the psychological impact. Chaos forces, creatures that knew no fear and felt no pain, began to retreat for the first time in recorded history. Demons that had terrorized entire sectors fled rather than face this single opponent. The retreat became a rout, then a complete abandonment of real space as entities that had fought the Imperium for millennia chose to return to the warp rather than continue the engagement. The aftermath revealed the true scope of what had been accomplished. The Chaos incursion, which had threatened to consume the entire Sabbat worlds, had been completely eliminated. Not defeated or driven back, but erased so thoroughly that no trace of corruption remained. Worlds that had been on the verge of becoming demon planets were restored to Imperial control without a single shot being fired by conventional forces, but the cost was becoming apparent as well. The reports from Hagia included descriptions that suggested the unknown warrior had begun to show signs of severe strain. His movements were less fluid than in earlier interventions. His armor bore new damage that had not been present before, and witnesses reported that he had difficulty maintaining solid form for extended periods. Most troubling, his voice had taken on qualities that suggested multiple personalities speaking in unison, as if his individual identity was beginning to fragment under the pressure of his existence. These observations confirmed the worst fears of those who understood the theoretical framework behind his transformation. Prolonged existence in the warp was taking its toll, not through corruption, but through simple attrition. The human psyche was not designed to withstand the pressures of existing in multiple dimensions simultaneously, and even someone as disciplined as Draigo would eventually reach the limits of what mortal consciousness could endure. The implications for the Imperium were sobering. The unknown warrior's interventions had become an essential component of humanity's defense against chaos, preventing incursions that conventional forces could not handle. But if the reports were accurate, that protection was temporary. Eventually, the strain of existence in the warp would overcome even the strongest will, and humanity would lose its most effective weapon against the forces of chaos. The question of what would happen then haunted the strategic planning of both the Grey Knights and the Inquisition. Would the unknown warrior simply fade away, his consciousness finally overwhelmed by the pressures of the warp? Would he be corrupted despite his best efforts, transformed into an enemy more dangerous than any daemon? Or would he find some way to transcend even these limitations, becoming something that existed beyond human understanding altogether? The answer would not come for several more years, during which the interventions continued with decreasing frequency, but increasing desperation. Each appearance seemed to cost more effort, require more time to recover, and produce less decisive results. The unknown warrior was clearly struggling against forces that exceeded even his enhanced capabilities, fighting a war of attrition that he could not hope to win indefinitely. The final confirmed intervention occurred during the siege of Kaldor, when Chaos forces launched their ultimate assault against the fortress world that guarded the only stable route out of the Eye of Terror. The battle raged for months, with Imperial forces suffering horrific casualties while barely holding their positions. Just when it seemed that the defenses would finally collapse, reports came in of massive Chaos casualties behind their own lines. The unknown warrior had appeared in the heart of the Chaos encampment, striking directly at the command structure that coordinated the entire assault. But witnesses reported that he seemed different, changed in ways that went beyond mere physical exhaustion. His armor was no longer the pristine Terminator plate described in earlier reports, but something that seemed to shift between different configurations, sometimes appearing as standard Imperial equipment, other times taking on characteristics that had never been seen in any human technology. Most disturbing were the reports of his behavior during this final intervention. Previous appearances had shown perfect tactical discipline, surgical strikes against specific targets with minimal collateral damage. But the assault on the Chaos command structure was different, characterized by a fury that seemed almost personal. The unknown warrior moved through enemy positions like an avenging angel, destroying not just military assets, but anything that bore the taint of chaos, regardless of its strategic value. The effectiveness was undeniable. The Chaos assault collapsed within hours, their leadership structure so thoroughly devastated that organized resistance became impossible. But the manner of the victory raised troubling questions about the psychological state of their mysterious ally. The surgical precision of earlier interventions had been replaced by something that resembled rage more than tactical calculation. After Kaldor, the interventions simply stopped. Months passed, then years, with no confirmed sightings of the unknown warrior. Chaos forces began to regain their confidence, launching new incursions that proceeded without the mysterious disruptions that had characterized the previous period. The Imperium's secret weapon had apparently reached the end of its effectiveness, leaving conventional forces to face threats that had previously been handled by intervention from the warp itself. The fate of Kaldor Draigo became one of the great mysteries of the 41st millennium, known only to the highest levels of Imperial authority and carefully hidden from any record that might be discovered by enemies. But those of us who had witnessed his sacrifice understood that he had achieved something unprecedented in human history: the transformation of a single individual into a force of nature that operated across dimensions, striking at the fundamental sources of humanity's greatest threats. Whether he still exists in some form, whether his consciousness persists in the depths of the warp, whether he might someday return to real space, these questions remain unanswered. But his legacy lives on in every successful banishment, every disrupted ritual, every moment when the forces of chaos falter for reasons they cannot understand. The techniques he developed, the principles he embodied, the absolute dedication he demonstrated, these have become integral parts of the Grey Knight's doctrine and the broader Imperial response to demonic incursion. The young Grey Knights who join the chapter now will never know the man who shaped their order into the finest demon-hunting force in the galaxy. They will train with weapons he blessed, study tactics he developed, recite prayers he perfected, but they will never meet the Supreme Grand Master who paid the ultimate price to protect humanity from its greatest enemies. His name is spoken only in the most private ceremonies, his deeds recorded only in documents that exist at levels of classification so high that most inquisitors will never see them. But perhaps that is enough. Perhaps the true measure of a warrior is not the recognition he receives, or the honors bestowed upon him, but the continuing effectiveness of the principles he embodied. Draigo's techniques are still taught, his strategies still employed, his example still inspiring new generations of Grey Knights to face the darkness without flinching. The war against chaos continues, fought on countless fronts by warriors whose names will never be known. But somewhere in the warp itself, in the heart of enemy territory, the memory of one Grey Knight's sacrifice serves as a reminder that no darkness is absolute, no corruption is inevitable, and no enemy is so powerful that it cannot be opposed by those willing to pay any price in defense of humanity. This is the story I was commanded to tell, though I know it will never be recorded in any official history. Some truths are too dangerous to write down, too precious to risk in documents that might be captured or corrupted, but they must be preserved somehow, passed down through whispered words and shared memories, kept alive in the hearts of those who understand what was sacrificed and why. Kaldor Draigo, Supreme Grand Master of the Grey Knights, servant of the Emperor, guardian of humanity. Lost to us, but never lost to the cause he served. His vigil continues in places where maps have no meaning, and time follows no earthly rules, an eternal sentinel standing watch over the dreams of a species that will never fully understand the price paid for their protection.